The snow bit harder than the wind, clawing at Caleb's face as he trudged through the alley, his boots crunching against the frozen slush. He was 42, and New York winters still felt like betrayal, like the city itself was spitting in his face for daring to survive another year. Then he saw the boy, curled against a dumpster, trembling so violently his teeth chattered loud enough to echo. Caleb stopped. The kid couldn't have been more than 16. His thin frame swallowed by a threadbare hoodie, his lips tinged blue. No one else was around, just the two of them, caught in the city's indifferent grip. Caleb's heart, battered as it was, lurched. He'd seen too many ghosts in his life to ignore this one. Without a word, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the one he'd worn through every brutal winter since he'd left that other life behind. He draped it over the boy's shoulders, the weight of it making the kid flinch. "You'll freeze out here," Caleb said, his voice rough but soft, like gravel smoothed by a river. The boy looked up, eyes wide and wary, but he pulled the coat tighter around himself. Something in those eyes, green, sharp, achingly familiar, hit Caleb like a fist to the chest. He shook it off. "Just a kid," he told himself. "Just a kid. I'm fine," the boy muttered, but his voice cracked, betraying him. He wasn't fine. He was starving, scared, and alone. Caleb crouched, keeping his distance, not wanting to spook him. The alley smelled of rot and diesel, but the boy's gaze held something purer, something that made Caleb's throat tighten. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Elliot." Caleb nodded, the name settling like a stone in his gut. "I'm Caleb. You got a place to go, Elliot?" Elliot's eyes darted away, his fingers clutching the coat's lapels. "Not really." Caleb had seen enough runaways to know the signs, kids who fled homes that weren't homes, carrying secrets too heavy for their brittle shoulders. He'd been one himself, once, before he'd built a life out of scraps and stubbornness. He ran a small community center now, a haven for kids like this, though it barely stayed afloat. He couldn't save them all, but he could try with this one. "Come with me," Caleb said, standing. "I've got a place. Warm food. A cot. No strings." Elliot's jaw tightened, suspicion etched into every line of his face. But the cold was a cruel negotiator, and he nodded, rising unsteadily. Caleb led the way, glancing back to make sure the kid didn't bolt. Those green eyes stayed with him, gnawing at a memory he couldn't place. The community center was a 10-minute walk, a squat brick building wedged between a bodega and a laundromat. Inside, it smelled of coffee and old books, with mismatched furniture and walls plastered with kids' drawings. Caleb gestured to a cot in the back room, where a space heater hummed. Elliot sank onto it, still clutching the coat, his gaze flickering between gratitude and distrust. "Stay as long as you need," Caleb said, handing him a bowl of chili from the kitchen. "We'll figure out tomorrow when it comes." Elliot ate in silence, his movements careful, like he was afraid the food would vanish. Caleb watched, his mind tugging at that nagging familiarity. He'd loved someone with eyes like that, a lifetime ago. Someone who'd broken his heart and left him to pick up the pieces. Someone who'd died too young, leaving nothing but regrets. As Elliot finished the chili, he looked up, his voice barely audible. "Why were you doing this?" Caleb leaned back in his chair, the question cutting deeper than it should have. "Because I've been where you are, and someone helped me once." Elliot's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Caleb felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. Fragile but real. He didn't know it yet. But this boy was about to unravel everything he thought he'd buried. The next morning, Caleb woke to find Elliot still there, curled under the coat like it was a shield. The kid looked younger in sleep. His face softened. But those eyes closed now still haunted Caleb. He busied himself with the center's endless tasks, restocking supplies, answering emails, ignoring the bills piling up. But his thoughts kept drifting to Elliot, to the way he'd flinched at sudden noises, to the weight in his gaze. By noon, Elliot was awake, hovering near the kitchen, watching Caleb like he was sizing him up. "You don't have to stay," Caleb said, tossing him a granola bar. "But if you do, you can help out. Dishes need washing." Elliot caught the bar, his fingers quick despite the cold still lingering in his bones. "I'm not a charity case," he said, but he stayed, scrubbing plates with a focus that made Caleb smile. The kid had pride, a spark that hadn't been snuffed out yet. Over the next few days, a routine formed. Elliot helped with small tasks, his guard lowering inch by inch. Caleb learned fragments of his story, a foster home that hadn't worked out, a school that didn't care, a life spent slipping through cracks. But Elliot never mentioned family, and Caleb didn't push. He knew better than anyone how some wounds bled too deep to touch. One night, as they sat over mugs of cocoa, Elliot spoke up, his voice hesitant. "You ever lose someone you loved?" Caleb froze, the question slicing through him. He saw those green eyes again. Not Elliot's, but hers, Lila's. The love of his life. The one who'd walked away when he'd come out to her, unable to reconcile her heart with his truth. She died in a car accident 3 years later, leaving Caleb with a grief he'd never shaken. He hadn't known she'd had a son. "Yeah," Caleb said finally, his voice thick. "I have." Elliot nodded, like he understood more than he let on. Caleb wanted to ask more, to dig into the boy's past. But something stopped him. Instead, he reached out, resting a hand on Elliot's shoulder. The kid didn't pull away. That night, Caleb lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Those eyes. That name. A suspicion was forming, one he didn't dare voice. Not yet. The days bled into a week, and Elliot became a fixture at the center. He was quiet but sharp, noticing things Caleb missed, like the leaky faucet in the bathroom or the kid who had food in his pockets. Caleb watched him, marveling at how someone so young could carry such weight and still keep going. But those green eyes never stopped tugging at him, pulling up memories he'd buried under years of routine. One afternoon, while sorting donated clothes, Elliot found an old Polaroid tucked into a jacket pocket. It was faded, but the image was clear. Caleb, 20 years younger, laughing with a woman whose smile could have lit the city. Lila. Caleb's breath caught as Elliot held it up, his brow furrowed. "Who's this?" Elliot asked, his tone curious but careful. Caleb took the photo, his fingers trembling. "Someone I used to know," he said, shoving it into his pocket. But Elliot's gaze lingered, searching, and Caleb felt the suspicion in his gut grow heavier. He needed answers, but he didn't know how to ask without breaking something. That night, a storm hit, the kind that rattled windows and turned streets into rivers. The center was packed with kids seeking shelter, and Caleb was stretched thin, handing out blankets and soup. Elliot pitched in without being asked, his quiet efficiency a lifeline. But when a fight broke out between two older teens, Elliot stepped in, his voice steady but fierce. "Back off," he said, standing between them, smaller but unafraid. The room went quiet, and Caleb saw something new in Hima's strength that reminded him of Lila. The way she'd stood up for what mattered, even when it cost her. Later, as the storm howled outside, Caleb found Elliot alone, staring at the rain-streaked window. "You were brave back there," Caleb said, sitting beside him. Elliot shrugged, but his eyes were distant. Had to be. No one else was going to stop them. Caleb nodded, recognizing that instinct. "You've had to be brave a lot, haven't you?" Elliot didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Caleb wanted to reach out, to tell him he didn't have to carry it all alone. But the words felt hollow. Instead, he handed Elliot a fresh mug of cocoa, their fingers brushing. The contact was brief, but it sparked something in Kaliba need to protect this boy, to understand him. The next morning, Caleb dug through old records in his office, searching for anything that might confirm his suspicion. He hadn't seen Lila in nearly 2 decades, but he knew she'd had a son before she died. The math lined up Elliot's age. Those eyes, the way his smile echoed hers. But Caleb needed proof, something concrete to anchor the storm in his chest. He found it in a forgotten email, buried in an old account he rarely checked. A message from Lila's sister, sent years ago, after the funeral. It mentioned a boy, her son, placed in foster care after her death. His name was Elliot. Caleb's heart stopped. He stared at the screen, the truth crashing over him like the storm outside. The boy he'd saved was Lila's son, his ex's only child. He didn't tell Elliot. Not yet. The kid was still skittish, still rebuilding trust. But Caleb watched him closer now, noticing the way he moved, the way he spoke, every gesture a ghost of Lila. It was both a gift and a wound, reopening scars Caleb thought had healed. One evening, as they cleaned the kitchen, Elliot spoke up, his voice soft but steady. "You ever feel like you're running from something, but you don't know what?" Caleb paused, a dish in his hands. "Every day," he admitted. "But sometimes, what you're running from finds you anyway." Elliot looked at him, those green eyes piercing, and Caleb knew he couldn't keep the truth buried much longer. But telling him meant risking everything, the fragile bond they'd built, the safety Elliot had found. Caleb wasn't ready to lose that. Not yet. The truth sat like a stone in Caleb's chest, heavy and unyielding. He watched Elliot move through the center, helping kids, fixing things, his quiet strength a mirror to the woman Caleb had loved and lost. But every time he thought to tell him, the words caught in his throat. How do you tell a boy you're tied to his past, to his pain, without shattering the trust you've earned? Winter deepened, and the center became a refuge for more than just Elliot. Caleb worked tirelessly, but the bills piled higher, threatening to bury his dream. Elliot noticed, his sharp eyes catching the worry lines on Caleb's face. One night, as they sorted donations, he spoke up. "You're going to lose this place, aren't you?" Elliot's voice was blunt, but there was no judgment, only concern. Caleb sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe. Doesn't mean I'll stop fighting for it." Elliot nodded, like he understood fighting against impossible odds. "Let me help. I'm good with numbers. I can look at the books." Caleb hesitated, then handed over the ledger. Elliot's focus was intense, his fingers flying over the pages, catching errors Caleb had missed. By midnight, they'd found a way to stretch the budget another month. Caleb looked at him, pride swelling despite the ache in his heart. This boy who was Lila's was saving him as much as he was saving the center. But the past wasn't done with them. One morning, a man showed up at the center, his suit crisp despite the slush outside. He introduced himself as a social worker, there to check on Elliot. Caleb's stomach twisted as the man asked questions, his tone clinical but probing. Elliot stood rigid, his eyes darting to Caleb for reassurance. "He's safe here," Caleb said, his voice firm. "He's got a place." The social worker nodded, but his gaze lingered on Elliot, who looked ready to bolt. After he left, Elliot disappeared into the back room, and Caleb found him there, clutching the coat like a lifeline. "They're going to take me back," Elliot whispered, his voice raw. "To another foster home. I can't do it again." Caleb knelt beside him, his heart breaking. "I won't let that happen. You're not going anywhere unless you want to." Elliot's eyes met his, searching for a lie. He didn't find one. For the first time, he leaned into Caleb, his head resting against his shoulder. Caleb froze, then wrapped an arm around him, the weight of the moment grounding them both. That night, Caleb made a decision. He couldn't keep the truth from Elliot any longer. He found him in the kitchen, washing dishes, and took a deep breath. "Elliot," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "There's something I need to tell you. About your mom." Elliot froze, the dish in his hand slipping into the sink. He turned, his face pale, those green eyes wide with something between fear and hope. "You knew her?" Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "Her name was Lila, and she was everything to me. Once." The air between them shifted, charged with a truth neither was ready for. Elliot's hands shook, but he didn't look away. Caleb told him everything: how he'd loved Lila, how they'd fallen apart, how he hadn't known about her son until now. He watched Elliot's face, waiting for anger, for rejection, but the boy just listened, his eyes glistening. When Caleb finished, Elliot was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She talked about you. Before she said you were the best thing that ever happened to her." Caleb's heart shattered, the weight of years collapsing in a single moment. He wanted to say more, to ask about Lila, about the life Elliot had lived. But the boy's expression stopped him. There was pain there, but also something softer: forgiveness. Maybe, or the start of it. The revelation hung between them, fragile as the snow outside. Elliot didn't run, didn't shut down, but he grew quieter, his eyes carrying a new weight. Caleb gave him space, knowing the truth about his mother was a wound that needed time to settle. But the center kept them busy, its chaos a strange kind of glue holding them together. Elliot threw himself into helping, his focus almost desperate. He fixed chairs, organized supplies, even tutored younger kids in math. Caleb watched, torn between pride and worry. The boy was running from something, maybe the past, maybe himself, and Caleb knew that kind of running never lasted. One evening, as they locked up, Elliot stopped at the door, his breath visible in the cold. "Why didn't you look for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you loved her, why didn't you find me?" Caleb's chest tightened. He'd asked himself the same question 1,000 times since learning the truth. "I didn't know," he said honestly. "Lila never told me about you." "If I'd known." Elliot nodded, but his eyes were distant. Caleb wanted to reach out, to pull him close, but he didn't. Instead, he said, "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The words seemed to anchor Elliot, if only for a moment. They walked back to the center in silence. The city's hum a backdrop to their unspoken bond. But trouble was brewing. The social worker returned, this time with a court order. Elliot's foster family wanted him back, claiming he was a runaway. Caleb's blood ran cold as he read the document. The legal jargon a wall between him and the boy he'd come to see as family. "We'll fight this," Caleb told Elliot, who looked like he'd been punched. "You're not going back to a place that hurts you." Elliot's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Caleb contacted a lawyer friend, scraping together what little money he had to build a case. The center's funds were already stretched thin, and this fight threatened to break them. But Caleb didn't care. He'd lost Lila. He wouldn't lose her son. The hearing was set for a week later, and the days leading up to it were a blur of preparation and dread. Elliot stayed close, his trust in Caleb a fragile thread. One night, as they sat in the empty center, Elliot spoke up. "If they take me, will you still care?" His voice was small, vulnerable in a way Caleb hadn't heard before. Caleb met his gaze, his own eyes burning. "Always. No matter what." Elliot looked away, but not before Caleb saw the tears. He reached out, squeezing the boy's shoulder. And for the first time, Elliot didn't flinch. It was a small victory, but it felt like everything. The night before the hearing, Caleb couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, staring at the Polaroid of him and Lila. He'd failed her once, letting their love fracture under the weight of his truth. He wouldn't fail her son. But doubt gnawed at him. What if he couldn't protect Elliot? What if the system tore them apart? He found Elliot in the back room, awake, staring at the coat Caleb had given him that first night. "She'd be proud of you," Caleb said, his voice thick. "For surviving. For being you." Elliot's lips trembled, but he managed a nod. "I wish I'd known her better." Caleb sat beside him, the silence heavy but warm. They were two broken pieces, fitting together in a way neither expected. Tomorrow would test them. But for now, they had this moment. This makeshift family. The courtroom was cold, not just from the air, but from the sterile weight of bureaucracy. Caleb sat beside Elliot, his hand steady on the boy's shoulder as the judge reviewed the case. The foster parents' lawyer painted Elliot as a troubled runaway, twisting his pain into a narrative of defiance. Caleb's heart burned with anger, but he kept his face calm for Elliot's sake. When it was their turn, Caleb's lawyer argued passionately, citing Elliot's progress at the center, his stability with Caleb. But the system was a machine, grinding down hope with procedure. The judge's face was unreadable, and when she adjourned for deliberation, Caleb felt the world tilt. Outside, Elliot was quiet, his hands stuffed in the coat's pockets. "If they send me back," he said, "I'll run again." Caleb's chest ached. "You won't have to. We'll find a way." But the words felt fragile against the system's weight. That night, Caleb pored over legal options, his eyes bleary from exhaustion. Elliot stayed close, helping where he could, his presence a reminder of why this fight mattered. They were a team now, bound by more than chance. The next day, a surprise cameo letter from Lila's sister, found in an old file Caleb had overlooked. It was addressed to him, written years ago, asking him to look out for Elliot if anything happened to her. It wasn't legal proof, but it was a lifeline, a piece of Lila's heart reaching across time. Caleb showed it to his lawyer, hope flickering. At the next hearing, the letter changed everything. The judge read it, her expression softening. She questioned Elliot directly, her voice gentle but firm. Elliot spoke haltingly, his words raw but honest about the foster home's neglect, the center's safety, Caleb's kindness. Caleb watched, pride and fear warring in his chest. The judge's ruling came like a thunderclap. Elliot could stay with Caleb, pending a formal guardianship process. Relief flooded Caleb, but Elliot's face was a mask, like he couldn't believe it was real. As they left the courtroom, Elliot grabbed Caleb's hand, holding tight. It was the first time he'd initiated contact, and it broke something open in Caleb's heart. Back at the center, they celebrated quietly, sharing pizza with the other kids. Elliot laughed for the first time, a sound that lit up the room. But Caleb knew this was only the beginning. Guardianship was a long road, and the center's future was still uncertain. Yet, looking at Elliot, he felt a strength he hadn't known he had. That night, Elliot found Caleb in the office, holding the Polaroid. "She'd like this," he said, his voice soft. "Us. Together." Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah. She would." They sat in silence, the weight of their shared past settling into something new. Hope, maybe, or the start of healing. But the world outside wasn't done with them. A new threat loomed, one Caleb couldn't yet see. But it was coming, and it would test them both. The center was alive with purpose, but a shadow hung over it. A developer had bought the block, and eviction notices were tacked to every door, including the center's. Caleb read the letter with a sinking heart. The city wanted progress, and his haven for lost kids didn't fit the plan. He hid the news from Elliot, not wanting to burden him, but the boy was too sharp. "What's wrong?" Elliot asked one morning, catching Caleb staring at the notice. Caleb sighed, handing it over. "They're shutting us down. We've got a month." Elliot's face hardened, but he didn't crumble. "We'll fight it. Like we fought for me." Caleb wanted to believe him, but the odds felt impossible. Still, Elliot's fire was contagious. They rallied the kids, the staff, even the neighborhood. Petitions circulated. Local news picked up the story. And Elliot, quiet, guarded Elliot, spoke at a community meeting, his voice steady as he told the crowd what the center meant to him. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his eyes fierce. "To have nowhere, then find a place that feels like home. This place saved me." The room erupted in applause, and Caleb's chest swelled. He saw Lila in him, her courage, her heart. But the fight was uphill. The developer had money, influence, and the city's ear. Caleb spent nights on the phone, begging for grants, for miracles, while Elliot organized protests, his determination a beacon. One evening, as they painted signs for a rally, Elliot opened up. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere," he said, his brush pausing. "But you made me feel like I do." Caleb's heart ached. "You always belonged, Elliot. I just helped you see it." Elliot smiled, a real one, and Caleb felt the weight of their bond deepen. But the clock was ticking. The developer offered a buyout, a sum that could have saved Caleb from debt, but it meant abandoning the kids. He refused, knowing it would cost him everything. The rally came, a cold day with a crowd that spilled into the street. Elliot stood beside Caleb, holding a sign that read, "Save our home." The community showed up: parents, neighbors, kids who'd found refuge at the center. But the developer's men were there too, watching, waiting. That night, A brick crashed through the center's window, glass shattering across the floor. A note was tied to it: give up or lose everything. Caleb's blood ran cold, but Elliot's eyes blazed. They're scared, he said. That means we're getting to them. Caleb nodded, but fear gnawed at him. This wasn't just about the center Anna Maria, it was about protecting Elliot, about keeping the promise he'd made to Lila's memory. They cleaned up the glass, boarded the window, and kept going. But the threat lingered. A storm on the horizon. The threats escalated. Another brick, then slashed tires on Caleb's old truck. The developer was playing dirty, and Caleb felt the walls closing in. He kept it from Elliot as best he could, but the boy noticed everything. One night, Caleb found him in the back room, staring at the coat, his face tight with worry. They're coming for us, aren't they? Elliot asked. Caleb wanted to lie, to shield him, but he couldn't. Yeah, but we're tougher than they think. Elliot nodded, his jaw set. I'm not running. Not this time. Their fight gained traction. A local activist group joined, then a city council member. The center became a symbol, a cause. But the developer's influence ran deep, and Caleb knew money often won over heart. He poured everything into the fight: his savings, his energy, his hope, knowing it might not be enough. One evening, Elliot came to him with a plan. We need to go bigger, he said, his eyes bright with determination. A fundraiser. Get the whole city involved. Caleb hesitated, exhausted, but Elliot's fire was undeniable. They organized it in days: a concert, bake sale, an art auction, all in the center's parking lot. The community showed up in droves, and Elliot took the stage, his voice shaking but clear as he told his story: a boy lost, then found, because of a coat and a man who cared. The crowd was silent, then erupted. Donations poured in, enough to keep the center afloat a little longer. Caleb watched Elliot, pride and love overwhelming him. This was Lila's son, but he was also his family, his fight. But the victory was short-lived. That night, Caleb got a call from the developer's lawyer, offering a final deal: leave quietly, or face consequences. Caleb hung up, his hands shaking. He didn't tell Elliot, but the boy found him later, his face pale. I heard, Elliot said. They're not going to stop. Caleb nodded, the weight of it crushing. We'll keep fighting. Together. Elliot reached for his hand, and Caleb held it, their bond a lifeline in the dark. The next day, they found a new Alia journalist who'd been following their story. She dug into the developers' shady deals, uncovering corruption that turned the tide. The city halted the eviction, pending an investigation. It wasn't a win. Not yet. But it was hope. Caleb and Elliot stood in the center, surrounded by kids and chaos. And for the first time, Caleb believed they might make it. He looked at Elliot, at the boy who'd become his heart, and knew they'd face whatever came next together. Spring came, softening the city's edges. But the fight wasn't over. The investigation dragged on, and the developers' threats grew quieter but no less real. Caleb and Elliot worked side by side, their bond a quiet strength. The center thrived, a beacon for kids who needed it. And Elliot bloomed, his laughter a sound Caleb cherished. One morning, as they painted a mural on the center's walnut tree, its branches full of names from every kid who'd found refuge there, Elliot spoke up. I want to stay. Forever. If you'll have me. Caleb's heart stopped. He'd been granted temporary guardianship. But this was more a choice. A family. "You're already home," he said, his voice thick. Elliot smiled, his green eyes bright with something new, peace. They finished the mural, their hands covered in paint. And Caleb felt Lila's presence, like she was watching. Proud. The developer's case collapsed under the weight of the journalist's findings. The center was safe, at least for now. Caleb and Elliot celebrated with the kids, the air filled with music and hope. But the real victory was quieter, deeper. It was in the way Elliot called him Dad one day, casual but deliberate, and the way Caleb's heart swelled, knowing he'd kept his promise to Lila. Years later, the center still stood, stronger than ever. Elliot was in college, studying social work, determined to give back. Caleb, grayer but no less stubborn, ran the center, his life full in a way he'd never imagined. They'd faced loss, fear, and a system that tried to break them. But they'd won not just the center, but each other. One evening, as snow fell again, Caleb found the coat, folded neatly in a closet. He ran his fingers over it, remembering that first night, the boy who'd changed everything. Elliot walked in, catching him, and smiled. "Still keeping me warm," Elliot said, his voice soft. Caleb laughed, pulling him into a hug. They stood there, two survivors, bound by a coat, a past, and a love that had defied the odds. The snow fell outside, but inside, they were home.